When Susie was 13, and a slender little maid with plaited tails of copper-tinged brown hair down her back, and was perhaps the busiest bee in the household hive, by reasons of the manifold studies, health exercises, and recreations she had to attend to, she secretly, and of her own motivation, and out of love, added another task to her labors, the writing of a biography of me. She did this work in her bedroom at night, and kept her record hidden. After a little, the mother discovered it and filched it, and let me see it, then told Susie what she had done, and how pleased I was, and how proud. I remember that time with a deep pleasure. I had had compliments before, but none that touched me like this. None that could approach it for value in my eyes. It has kept that place always since. I have had no compliment, no praise, no tribute from any source that was so precious to me as this one was and still is. As I read it now, after all these many years, it is still a king's message to me, and brings me the same dear surprise it brought me then, with the pathos added of the thought that the eager and hasty hand that sketched it and scrawled it will not touch mine again. And I feel as the humble and unexpectant must feel when their eyes fall upon the edict which raises them to the ranks of the noble. Yesterday, while I was rummaging in a pile of ancient notebooks of mine which I had not seen for years, I came across a reference to that biography. It is quite evident that several times, at breakfast and dinner in those long past days, I was posing for the biography. In fact, I clearly remember that I was doing that. And I also remember that Susie detected it. I remember saying a very smart thing with a good deal of an air at the breakfast table one morning, and that Susie observed to her mother privately a little later that Papa was doing that for the biography. I cannot begin to bring myself to change any line or word in Susie's sketch of me, but will introduce passages from it now and then, just as they came in their quaint simplicity out of her honest heart, which was the beautiful heart of a child. What comes from that source has a charm and grace of its own, which may transgress all the recognized laws of literature, if it choose, and yet be literature still, and worthy of hospitality. I shall print the whole of this little biography before I have done with it, every word, every sentence. The spelling is frequently desperate, but it was Susie's, and it shall stand. I love it and cannot profane it. To me it is gold. To correct it would alloy it, not refine it. It would spoil it. It would take from it its freedom and flexibility, and make it stiff and formal. Even when it is most extravagant, I am not shocked. It is Susie's spelling, and she was doing the best she could, and nothing could better it for me. Susie began the autobiography in 1885, when I was in the 50th year of my age, and she just entering the 14th of hers. She begins in this way. We are a very happy family. We consist of Papa, Mama, Jean, Clara, and me. It is Papa I am writing about, and I shall have no trouble in not knowing what to say about him, as he is a very striking character. But wait a minute. I will return to Susie presently. In the manner of slavish imitation, man is the monkey's superior all the time. The average man is destitute of independence of opinion. He is not interested in contriving an opinion of his own by study and reflection, but is only anxious to find out what his neighbor's opinion is and slavishly adopt it. A generation ago, I found out that the latest review of a book was pretty sure to be just a reflection of the earliest review of it. That whatever the first reviewer found to praise or censure in the book would be repeated in the latest reviewer's report with nothing fresh added. Therefore, more than once, I took the precaution of sending my book in manuscript to Mr. Howells when he was editor of the Atlantic Monthly, so that he could prepare a review of it at leisure. I knew he would say the truth about the book. I also knew that he would find more merit than demerit in it, because I already knew that that was the condition of the book. I allowed no copy of it to go out to the press until after Mr. Howell's notice of it had appeared. That book was always safe. There wasn't a man behind a pen in all America that had the courage to find anything in the book which Mr. Howells had not found. There wasn't a man behind a pen in America that had spirit enough to say a brave and original thing about the book on his own responsibility. I believe that the trade of critic in literature, music, and the drama is the most degraded of all trades, and that it has no real value, certainly no large value. When Charles Dudley Warner and I were about to bring out The Gilded Age, the editor of the Daily Graphic persuaded me to let him have an advanced copy, and giving me his word of honor that no notice of it would appear in his paper until after the Atlantic Monthly notice should have appeared. This reptile published a review of the book within 3 days afterward. I could not really complain, because he had only given me his word of honor as security. I ought to have required of him something substantial. I believe his notice did not deal mainly with the merit of the book, or the lack of it, but with my moral attitude toward the public. It was charged that I had used my reputation to play a swindle upon the public, that Mr. Warner had written as much as half of the book, and that I had used my name to float it and give it currency. A currency, so the critic averred, which could not have acquired without my name, and that this conduct of mine was a grave fraud upon the people. The Graphic was not an authority upon any subject whatever. It had a sort of distinction, in that it was the first and only illustrated daily newspaper in the world that the world had seen, but it was without character. It was poorly and cheaply edited. Its opinion of a book or any other work of art was no consequence. Everybody knew this, yet all the critics in America, one after the other, copied the Graphic's criticism, merely changing the phraseology, and left me under that charge of dishonest conduct. Even the great Chicago Tribune, the most important journal in the Middle West, was not able to invent anything fresh, but adopted the view of the humble Daily Graphic, dishonesty charge and all. However, let it go. It is the will of God that we must have critics, and missionaries, and congressmen, and humorists, and we must bear the burden. Meantime, I seem to have been drifting into criticism myself. But that is nothing. At the worst, criticism is nothing more than a crime, and I am not unused to that. What I have been traveling towards all this time is this. The first critic that ever had occasion to describe my personal appearance littered his description with foolish and inexcusable errors whose aggregate furnished the result that I was distinctly and distressingly unhandsome. That description floated around the country in the papers and was in consistent use and wear for a quarter of a century. It seems strange to me that apparently no critic in the country could be found who could look at me and have the courage to take up his pen and destroy that lie. That lie began its course on the Pacific coast in 1864, and it likened me in personal appearance to Petroleum V. Nasby, who had been out there lecturing. For 25 years afterwards, no critic could furnish a description of me without fetching in Nasby to help out my portrait. I knew Nasby well, and he was a good fellow, but in my life I have not felt malignant enough about any more than 3 persons to charge those persons with resembling Nasby. It hurts me to the heart. I was always handsome. Anybody but a critic could have seen it. And it had long been a distress to my family, including Susie, that the critics should go on making this wearisome mistake year after year, when there was no foundation for it. Even when a critic wanted to be particularly friendly and complimentary to me, he didn't dare go beyond my clothes. He never ventured beyond that old, safe frontier. When he had finished with my clothes, he had said all the kind things, the pleasant things, the complimentary things he could risk. Then he dropped back on Nasby. Yesterday, I found this clipping in the pocket of one of those ancient memorandum books of mine. It is of the date of 39 years ago, and both the paper and the ink are yellow with the bitterness that I felt in that old day when I clipped it out to preserve it and brood over it, and grieve about it. I will copy it here, to wit, a correspondent of the Philadelphia Press, writing one of Schuyler Colfax's receptions, says of our Washington correspondent, Mark Twain, the delicate humorist, was present. Quite a lion he deserves to be. Mark is a bachelor, faultless in taste, whose snowy vest is suggestive of endless quarrels with Washington washerwomen. But the heroism of Mark is settled for all time, for such purity and smoothness were never seen before. His lavender gloves might have been stolen from some Turkish harem, so delicate were they in size, but more likely anything else were more likely than that. In form and feature, he bears some resemblance to the immortal Nasby, but whilst Petroleum is brunette to the core, Twain is golden, amber-hued, melting blonde. Let us return to Susie's biography now, and get the opinion of one who is unbiased. From Susie's biography. Papa's appearance has been described many times, but very incorrectly. He has beautiful gray hair, not any too thick or any too long, but just right. A Roman nose, which greatly improves the beauty of his features. Kind blue eyes and a small mustache. He has a wonderfully shaped head and profile. He has a very good figure. In short, he is an extraordinarily fine-looking man. All his features are perfect, except that he hasn't any extraordinary teeth. His complexion is very fair, and he doesn't wear a beard. He is a very good man and a very funny one. He has got a temper, but we all of us have in this family. He is the loveliest man I ever saw or ever hope to see, and oh, so absent-minded. He does tell perfectly delightful stories. Clara and I used to sit on each arm of his chair and listen while he told us stories about the pictures on the wall. I remember the storytelling days vividly. They were a difficult and exacting audience, those little creatures. Along one side of the library in the Hartford home, the bookshelves joined the mantelpiece. In fact, there were shelves on both sides of the mantelpiece. On these shelves and on the mantelpiece stood various ornaments. At one end of the procession was a framed oil painting of a cat's head, and on the other end was the head of a beautiful young girl, life-size, called Emmeline, because she looked just about like that, an impressionist watercolor. Between the one picture and the other, there were 12 or 15 of the bric-a-brac things already mentioned, also an oil painting by Ella Vedder, the young Medusa. Every now and then, the children required me to construct a romance, always impromptu, not a moment's preparation permitted. And into that romance, I had to get all that bric-a-brac and the 3 pictures. I had to start always with the cat and finish with Emmeline. I was never allowed the refreshment of a change, end for end. It was not permissible to introduce a bric-a-brac or ornament into the story out of its place in the procession. These bric-a-bracs were never allowed a peaceful day, a reposeful day, a restful Sabbath. In their lives there was no Sabbath. In their lives there was no peace. They knew no existence but a monotonous career of violence and bloodshed. In the course of time, the bric-a-brac and the pictures showed wear. It was because they had had so many and such tumultuous adventures in their romantic careers. As a romancer to the children, I had a hard time even from the beginning. If they brought me a picture in a magazine and required me to build a story to it, they would cover the rest of the page with their pudgy hands to keep me from stealing an idea from it. The stories had to come hot from the bat, always. They had to be absolutely original and fresh. Sometimes the children furnished me with simply a character or 2, or a dozen, and required me to start out at once on that slim basis, and deliver those characters up to a vigorous and entertaining life of crime. If they heard of a new trade, or an unfamiliar animal, or anything like that, I was pretty sure to have to deal with those things in the next romance. Once, Clara required me to build a sudden tale out of a plumber and a boa constrictor, and I had to do it. She didn't know what a boa constrictor was until he developed in the tale. Then she was better satisfied with it than ever. From Susie's Autobiography. Papa's favorite game is billiards, and when he is tired and wishes to rest himself, he stays up all night and plays billiards. It seems to rest his head. He smokes a great deal, almost incessantly. He has the mind of an author exactly. Some of the simplest things he can't understand. Our burglar alarm is often out of order, and Papa had been obliged to take the mahogany room off from the alarm altogether for a time, because the burglar alarm had been in the habit of ringing even when the mahogany room was closed. At length, he thought that perhaps the burglar alarm might be in order, and he decided to try and see. Accordingly, he put it on and then went down and opened the window. Consequently, the alarm bell rang. It would, even if the alarm had been in order. Papa went despairingly upstairs and said to Mama, "Livy, the mahogany room won't go on. I have just opened the window to see." "Why, youth," Mama replied, "if you've opened the window, why, of course the alarm will ring." "That's what I've opened it for. Why, I just went down to see if it would ring." Mama tried to explain to Papa that when he wanted to go and see whether the alarm would ring while the window was closed, he mustn't go and open the window. But in vain. Papa couldn't understand, and got very impatient with Mama for trying to make him believe an impossible thing true. This is a frank biographer, and an honest one. She uses no sandpaper on me. I have, to this day, the same dull head in the matter of conundrums and perplexities which Susie has discovered in those long-gone days. Complexities annoy me. They irritate me. Then this progressive feeling presently warms into anger. I cannot get far in the reading of the commonest and simplest contract, with its parties of the first part, and parties of the second part, and parties of the third part, before my temper is all gone. Ashcroft comes up here every day and pathetically tries to make me understand the points of the lawsuit which we are conducting against Henry Butters, Harold Wheeler, and the rest of those plasmon buccaneers. But daily he has to give it up. It is pitiful to see, when he bends his earnest and appealing eyes upon me and says, after one of his efforts, "Now do you understand that, don't you?" I am always obliged to say, "I don't, Ashcroft. I wish I could understand it, but I don't. Send for the cat." In the days which Susie is talking about, a perplexity fell to my lot one day. F.G. Whitmore was my business agent, and he brought me out from town in his buggy. We drove by the porte-cochere and toward the stable. Now this was a single road, and was like a spoon whose handle stretched from the gate to a great round flower bed in the neighborhood of the stable. At the approach to the flower bed, the road divided and circumnavigated it, making a loop, which I have likened to the bowl of the spoon. As we neared the loop, I saw that Whitmore was laying his course to port. I was sitting on the starboard side, the side the house was on, and was going to start around that spoon bowl on that left-hand side. I said, "Don't do that, Whitmore. Take the right-hand side. Then I shall be next to the house when we get to the door." He said, "That will not happen in any case. It doesn't make any difference which way I go around this flower bed." I explained to him that he was an ass, but he stuck to his proposition, and I said, "Go on, try it and see." He went on and tried it, and sure enough, he fetched me up at the door on the very side that he had said I would be. I was not able to believe it then, and I don't believe it yet. I said, "Whitmore, that is merely an accident. You can't do it again." He said he could, and he drove down into the street, fetched around, came back, and actually did it again. I was stupefied, paralyzed, petrified, with these strange results. But they did not convince me. I didn't believe he could do it another time, but he did. He said he could do it all day, and fetch up the same way every time. By that time, my temper was gone, and I asked him to go home and apply to the asylum, and I would pay the expenses. I didn't want to see him any more for a week. I went upstairs in a rage and started to tell Livy about it, expecting to get her sympathy for me and to breed aversion in her for Whitmore. But she merely burst into a peal after peal of laughter as the tale of my adventure went on, for her head was like Susie's. Riddles and complexities had no terrors for it. Her mind and Susie's were analytical. I have tried to make it appear that mine was different. Many and many a time I have told that buggy experiment, hoping against hope that I would some time or another find somebody who would be on my side, but it has never happened, and I am never able to go glibly forward and state the circumstances of that buggy's progress without having to halt and consider, and call up in my mind the spoon handle, the bowl of the spoon, the buggy and the horse, and my position in the buggy. And the minute I have got that far and try to turn it to the left, it goes to ruin. I can't see how it is ever going to fetch me out right when we get to the door. Susie is right in her estimate. I can't understand things. That burglar alarm, which Susie mentions, had a gay and careless life, and had no principles. It was generally out of order at one point or another, and there was plenty of opportunity, because all the windows and the doors in the house, from the cellar up to the top floor, were connected with it. However, in its seasons of being out of order, it could trouble us for only a very little while. We quickly found out that it was fooling us, and that it was buzzing its blood-curdling alarm merely for its own amusement. Then we would shut it off and send to New York for the electrician, there not being one in all Hartford in those days. When the repairs were finished, we would set the alarm again and re-establish our confidence in it. It never did any real business except on one single occasion. All the rest of its expensive career was frivolous and without purpose. Just that one time it performed its duty, and its whole duty, gravely, seriously, admirably. It let fly about 2:00 one black and dreary March morning, and I turned out promptly, because I knew that it was not fooling this time. The bathroom door was on my side of the bed. I stepped in there, turned up the gas, looked at the annunciator, and turned off the alarm, so far as the door indicated was concerned, thus stopping the racket. Then I came back to bed. Mrs. Clemens opened the debate. What was it? It was the cellar door. Was it a burglar, do you think? Yes, I said. Of course it was. Did you suppose it was a Sunday school superintendent? No. What do you suppose he wants? I suppose he wants jewelry, but he is not acquainted with the house, and he thinks it is in the cellar. I don't like to disappoint a burglar with whom I am not acquainted, and who has done me no harm, but if he had had any common sagacity enough to inquire, I could have told him we kept nothing down there but coal and vegetables. Still, it may be that he is acquainted with the place, and what he really wants is coal and vegetables. On the whole, I think it is vegetables he is after. Are you going down to see? No, I could not be of any assistance. Let him select for himself. I don't know where the things are. Then she says, Suppose he comes up to the ground floor. That's all right. We shall know it the minute he opens the door on that floor. It will set off the alarm. Just then, the terrible buzzing broke out again. I said, He has arrived. I told you he would. I know all about burglars and their ways. They are systematic people. I went into the bathroom to see if I was right, and I was. I shut off the dining room and stopped the buzzing and came back to bed. My wife said, What do you suppose he is after now? I said, I think he has got all the vegetables he wants and is coming up for napkin rings and odds and ends for the wife and children. They all have families, burglars have, and they are always thoughtful of them, always take a few necessaries of life for themselves and fill out with tokens of remembrance for the family. In taking them, they do not forget us. Those very things represent tokens of his remembrance of us, and also of our remembrance of him. We never get them again. The memory of the attention remains embalmed in our hearts. Are you going down to see what it is he wants now? No, I said. I am no more interested than I was before. They are experienced people, burglars. They know what they want. I shall be no help to him. I think he is after ceramics and bric-a-brac and such things. If he knows the house, he knows that that is all he can find on the dining room floor. She said, with a strong interest perceptible in her tone, Suppose he comes up here? I said, It is all right. He will give us notice. What shall we do then? Climb out of the window. She said, a little resistingly, Well, what is the use of a burglar alarm for us? You have seen, dear heart, that it has been useful up to the present moment, and I have explained to you how it will continuously be useful after he gets up here. That was the end of it. He didn't ring any more alarms. Presently, I said, he is disappointed, I think. He has gone off with the vegetables and the bric-a-brac, and I think he is dissatisfied. We went to sleep, and at 8:15 in the morning, I was out and hurrying, for I was to take the 8:29 train for New York. I found the gas burning brightly, full ahead, all over the first floor. My new overcoat was gone. My old umbrella was gone. My new patent leather shoes, which I had never worn, were gone. The large window, which opened into the ombre near the rear of the house, was standing wide. I passed out through it and tracked the burglar down the hill through the trees. Tracked him without difficulty, because he had blazed his progress with imitation silver napkin rings and my umbrella and various other things which he had disapproved of, and I went back in triumph and proved to my wife that he was a disappointed burglar. I had suspected he would be from the start, and from his not coming up to our floor to get human beings. Things happened to me that day in New York. I will tell you about them another time. From Susie's biography. Papa has a peculiar gait we like. It seems to just suit him, but most people do not. He always walks up and down the room while thinking, and between each course at meals. A lady, distantly related to us, came to visit us once in those days. She came to stay a week, but all our efforts to make her happy failed. We could not imagine why, and she got up her anchor and sailed the next morning. We did much guessing, but could not solve the mystery. Later, we found out what the trouble was. It was my tramping up and down between the courses. She conceived the idea that I could not stand her society. That word, youth, as the reader has perhaps already guessed, was my wife's pet name for me. It was gently satirical, but also affectionate. I had certain mental and material peculiarities and customs proper to a much younger person than I was. From Susie's biography. Papa is very fond of animals, particularly of cats. We had a dear little gray kitten once that he named Lazy. Papa always wears gray to match his hair and eyes. He would carry him around on his shoulder. It was a mighty pretty sight. The gray cat sound asleep up against Papa's gray coat and hair. The names that he has given our different cats are really remarkably funny. They are namely Stray, Stray Kit, Abner, Motley, Fraulein, Lazy, Buffalo Bill, Cleveland, Sour Mash, and Pestilence and Famine. At one time, when the children were small, we had a very black mother cat named Satan, and Satan had a small black offspring named Sin. Pronouns were a difficulty for the children. Little Clara came in one day, her black eyes snapping with indignation, and said, "Papa, Satan ought to be punished. She is out there at the greenhouse, and there she stays, and his kitten is downstairs crying." From Susie's biography. Papa uses very strong language, but I have an idea not nearly so strong as when he first married Mama. A lady acquaintance of his is rather apt to interrupt what one is saying, and Papa told Mama that he thought he should say to the lady's husband, "I am glad your wife wasn't present when the deity said, 'Let there be a light.'" It is as I have said before. This is a frank historian. She doesn't cover up one's deficiencies, but gives them an equal showing with one's handsomer qualities. Of course, I made the remark which she has quoted, and even at this distant day I am still as much as half persuaded that if that lady had been present when the Creator said, "Let there be light," she would have interrupted him, and we shouldn't ever have got it. From Susie's biography. Papa said the other day, "I am a mugwump, and a mugwump is pure from the marrow out." Papa knows that I am writing this biography of him, and he said it for this. He doesn't like to go to church at all. Why, I never understood, until just now. He told us the other day that he couldn't bear to hear anyone talk but himself, but that he could listen to himself talk for hours. Susie's remark about my strong language troubles me, and I must go back to it. All through the first 10 years of my married life, I kept a constant and discreet watch upon my tongue while in the house, and went outside to a distance when circumstances were too much for me, and I was obliged to seek relief. Yeah, the reporters saying that he was ugly is super funny. I wonder if there are some pictures of that V. Nasby that we compare it to. He sounds like he was pretty upset to have been compared to him all those times. Susie's remark about my strong language troubles me, and I must go back to it. All through the first 10 years of my married life, I kept a constant and discreet watch upon my tongue while in the house, and went outside and to a distance when circumstances were too much for me, and I was obliged to seek relief. I prized my wife's respect and approval above all the rest of the human race's respect and approval. I dreaded the day when she should discover that I was but a witted sepulchre, partly freighted with suppressed language. I was so careful during 10 years that I had not a doubt that my suppressions had been successful. Therefore, I was quite as happy in my guilt as I could have been if I had been innocent. But at last an accident exposed me. I went into the bathroom one morning to make my toilet and carelessly left the door 2 or 3 inches ajar. It was the first time that I had ever failed to take the precaution of closing it tightly. I knew the necessity of being particular about this, because shaving was always a trying ordeal for me, and I could seldom carry it through to a finish without verbal helps. Now this time I was unprotected, but did not suspect it. I had no extraordinary trouble with my razor on this occasion, and was able to worry through with mere mutterings and growlings of an improper sort, but with nothing noisy or emphatic about them. No snapping and barking. Then I put on a shirt. My shirts are an invention of my own. They open in the back and are buttoned there when there are buttons. This time the button was missing. My temper jumped up several degrees in a moment, and my remarks rose accordingly, both in loudness and vigor of expression. But I was not troubled, for the bathroom door was a solid one, and I supposed it was firmly closed. I flung up the window and threw the shirt out. It fell upon the shrubbery where the people on their way to church could admire it if they wanted to. There was merely 50 feet of grass between the shirt and the passerby. Still rumbling and thundering distantly, I put on another shirt. Again, the button was absent. I augmented my language to meet the emergency and threw that shirt out of the window. I was too angry, too insane to examine the third shirt, but put it furiously on. Again, the button was absent, and that shirt followed its comrades out the window. Then I straightened up, gathered my reserves, and let myself go like a cavalry charge. In the midst of that great assault, my eye fell upon that gaping door, and I was paralyzed. It took me a good while to finish my toilet. I extended the time unnecessarily in trying to make up my mind as to what I would best do in the circumstances. I tried to hope that Mrs. Clemens was asleep, but I knew better. I could not escape by the window. It was narrow and suited only to shirts. At last I made up my mind to boldly loaf through the bedroom with the air of a person who had not been doing anything. I made half the journey successfully. I did not turn my eyes in her direction, because that would not be safe. It is very difficult to look as if you have not been doing anything when the facts are the other way. And my confidence in my performance oozed steadily out of me as I went along. I was aiming for the left-hand door because it was furthest from my wife. It had never been opened from the day that the house was built, but it seemed a blessed refuge for me now. The bed was this one wherein I am laying now and dictating these histories morning after morning with so much serenity. It was this same old, elaborately carved black Venetian bedstead, the most comfortable bedstead that ever was, with space enough in it for a family, and carved angels enough surmounting its twisted columns and its headboard and footboard to bring peace to the sleepers and pleasant dreams. I had to stop in the middle of the room. I hadn't the strength to go on. I believed that I was under accusing eyes, that even the carved angels were inspecting me with an unfriendly gaze. You know how it is when you are convinced that somebody behind you is looking steadily at you. You have to turn your face. You can't help it. I turned mine. The bed was placed as it is now, with the foot where the head ought to be. If it had been placed as it should have been, the high headboard would have sheltered me. But the footboard was no sufficient protection, for I could be seen over it. I was exposed. I was wholly without protection. I turned because I couldn't help it, and my memory of what I saw is still vivid after all these years. Against the white pillows, I saw the black head. I saw that young and beautiful face. I saw the gracious eyes with something in them which I had never seen there before. They were snapping and flashing with indignation. I felt myself crumbling. I felt myself shrinking away to nothing under that accusing gaze. I stood silent under that desolating fire for as much as a minute, I should say. It seemed a very, very long time. Then my wife's lips parted, and from them issued my latest bathroom remark, the language perfect, but the expression velvety, unpractical, apprentice-like, ignorant, inexperienced, comically inadequate, absurdly weak and unsuited to the great language. In my lifetime I had never heard anything so out of tune, so inharmonious, so incongruous, so ill-suited to each other as were those mighty words set to that feeble music. I tried to keep from laughing, for I was a guilty person in need of charity and mercy. I tried to keep from bursting, and I succeeded, until she gravely said, "There, now you can know how it sounds." Then I exploded. The air was filled with my fragments, and you could hear them whiz. I said, "Oh, Livy, if it sounds like that, I will never do it again." Then she had to laugh herself. Both of us broke into convulsions, and went on laughing until we were physically exhausted and spiritually reconciled. The children were present at breakfast. Clara, aged 6, and Susie, 8, and the mother made a guarded remark about strong language, guarded because she did not wish the children to suspect anything. A guarded remark which censured strong language. Both children broke out in one voice with this comment, "Why, Mama, Papa uses it." I was astonished. I had supposed that secret was safe in my own breast, and that its presence had never been suspected. I asked, "How did you know, you little rascals?" "Oh," they said, We often listen over the balusters when you are in the hall explaining things to George. From Susie's biography. One of Papa's latest books is The Prince and the Pauper, and it is unquestionably the best book he has ever written. Some people want him to keep his old style. Some gentleman wrote him, "I enjoyed Huckleberry Finn immensely, and am glad to see that you have returned to your old style. That annoyed me greatly, because it troubles me." Susie was troubled by that word. Uncertain, she wrote a U in it in the proper place, but reconsidered the matter and struck it out. To have so few people know Papa, really know him. They think of Mark Twain as a humorist, joking at everything, and with a mop of a reddish-brown hair which sorely needs the barber's brush, a Roman nose, a short, stubby mustache, a sad, careworn face with mangy crow's feet, etc. That is the way people picture Papa. I have wanted Papa to write a book that would reveal something of his kind, sympathetic nature, and The Prince and the Pauper partly does it. The book is full of lovely, charming ideas, and oh, the language! It is perfect. I think that one of the most touching scenes in it is where the pauper is riding on horseback and with his nobles in the recognition procession, and he sees his mother. Oh, and then what followed. How she runs to his side when she sees him, throws up his hand palm outward, and is rudely pushed off by one of the king's officers, and then how the little pauper's conscience troubles him when he remembers the shameful words that were falling from his lips when she was turned from his side. "I know you not, woman," and how his grandeurs were stricken valueless and his pride consumed to ashes. It is a wonderfully beautiful and touching little scene, and Papa has described it so wonderfully. I never saw a man with so much variety of feeling as Papa has, and now The Prince and the Pauper is full of touching places, but there is most always a streak of humor in them somewhere. Now in the stirring coronation, just after the little king has got his crown back again, Papa brings that about in the seal, where the pauper says he used a seal to crack nuts with. Oh, it is so funny and nice. Papa very seldom writes a passage without some humor in it somewhere, and I don't think he ever will. The children always helped their mother to edit my books in manuscript. She would sit on the porch at the farm and read aloud with her pencil in her hand, and the children would keep an alert and suspicious eye upon her right along, for the belief was well grounded in them that whenever she came across a particularly satisfactory passage, she would strike it out. Their suspicions were well founded. The passages which were so satisfactory to them always had an element of strength in them which sorely needed modification or expurgation. They were always sure to get it at their mother's hand. For my own entertainment, and to enjoy the protests of the children, I often abused my editor's innocent confidence. I often interlarded the remarks of a studied and felicitously atrocious character purposely to achieve the children's brief delight, and then see the remorseless pencil do its fatal work. I often joined my supplications to the children's for mercy, and strung the argument out and pretended to be in earnest. They were deceived, and so was their mother. It was 3 against 1, and most unfair, but it was very delightful, and I could not resist the temptation. Now and then we gained the victory, and there was much rejoicing. Then I privately struck the passage out myself. It had served its purpose. I had furnished 3 of us with good entertainment, and in being removed from the book by me, it was only suffering the fate originally intended for it. From Susie's biography. Papa was born in Missouri. His mother is Grandma Clemens, Jane Lambton Clemens of Kentucky. Grandpa Clemens was of the FFVs of Virginia. Without doubt, it was I that gave Susie that impression. I cannot imagine why, because I was never in my life much impressed by grandeurs which proceeded from the accident of birth. I did not get this indifference from my mother. She was always strongly interested in the ancestry of the house. She traced her own line back to the Lambtons of Durham, England, a family which had been occupying broad lands there since Saxon times. I am not sure, but I think that those Lambtons got along without titles of nobility for 800 or 900 years, then produced a great man 3/4 of a century ago, and broke into the peerage. My mother knew all about the Clemenses of Virginia, and loved to aggrandize them to me, but she has long been dead. There has been no one to keep those details fresh in my memory, and they have grown dim. There was a J. Clemens, who was a United States Senator, and in his day enjoyed the usual senatorial fame, a fame which perishes whether it springs from 4 years' service or 40. After J. Clemens's fame as a senator passed away, he was still remembered for many years on account of another service which he performed. He shot old John Brown's Governor Wise in the hind leg in a duel. However, I am not very clear about this. It may be that Governor Wise shot him in the hind leg. However, I don't think it is important. I think that the only thing that is really important is that one of them got shot in the hind leg. It would have been better and nobler and more historical and satisfactory if both of them had got shot in the hind leg, but it is of no use for me to try to recollect history. I never had a historical mind. Let it go. Whichever way it happened, I am glad of it, and that it's as much enthusiasm as I can get up for a person bearing my name. But I am forgetting the first Clemens, the one that stands furthest back toward the really original first Clemens, which was Adam. From Susie's biography. Clara and I are sure that Papa played the trick on Grandma about the whipping that is related in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Hand me that switch. The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. My, look behind you, Aunt. The old lady whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The lad fled on the instant, scrambling up the high board fence and disappeared over it. Susie and Clara were quite right about that. Then Susie says, "And we know Papa played hooky all the time, and how readily would Papa pretend to be dying so as not to have to go to school?" These revelations and exposures are searching, but they are just if I am as transparent to other people as I was to Susie. I have wasted much effort in life. Grandma couldn't make Papa go to school. No, she let him go into a printing office to learn the trade. He did so, and gradually picked up enough education to enable him to do about as well as those who were more studious in early life. It is noticeable that Susie does not get overheated when she is complimenting me, but maintains a proper judicial and biographical claim. It is noticeable also, and it is to her credit as a biographer, that she distributes compliment and criticism with a fair and even hand. My mother had a good deal of trouble with me, but I think she enjoyed it. She had none at all with my brother Henry, who was 2 years younger than I, and I think that the unbroken monotony of his goodness and truthfulness and obedience would have been a burden to her but for the relief and variety which I furnished in the other direction. I was a tonic. I was valuable to her. I never thought of it before, but now I see it. I never knew Henry to do a vicious thing toward me or towards anyone else, but he frequently did righteous ones that cost me as heavily. It was his duty to report me when I needed reporting and neglected to do it myself, and he was very faithful in discharging that duty. He is Sid in Tom Sawyer, but Sid was not Henry. Henry was a very much finer and better boy than ever Sid was. It was Henry who called my mother's attention to the fact that the thread with which he had sewed my collar together to keep me from going in swimming had changed color. My mother would not have discovered it but for that, and she was manifestly piqued when she recognized that that prominent bit of circumstantial evidence had escaped her sharp eye. That detail probably added a detail to my punishment. It is human. We generally visit our shortcomings on somebody else when there is a possible excuse for it. But no matter, I took it out of Henry. There is always compensation for such as are unjustly used. I often took it out of him, sometimes as an advance payment for something which I hadn't yet done. These were occasions when the opportunity was too strong a temptation, and I had to draw on the future. I did not need to copy this idea from my mother, and probably didn't. She still wrought upon that principle upon occasion. If the incident of the broken sugar bowl is in Tom Sawyer, I don't remember whether it is or not. That is an example of it. Henry never stole sugar. He took it openly from the bowl. His mother knew he wouldn't take sugar when she wasn't looking, but she had her doubts about me. Not exactly doubts, either. She knew very well I would. One day, when she was not present, Henry took sugar from her prized and precious old English sugar bowl, which was an heirloom in the family, and he managed to break the bowl. It was the first time I had ever had a chance to tell anything on him, and I was inexpressibly glad. I told him I was going to tell on him, but he was not disturbed. When my mother came in and saw the bowl lying on the floor in fragments, she was speechless for a minute. I allowed that silence to work. I judged it would increase the effect. I was waiting for her to ask, "Who did that?" that I could fetch out my news. But it was an error of calculation. When she got through with her silence, she didn't ask anything about it. She merely gave me a crack on the skull with her thimble that I felt all the way down to my heels. Then I broke out with my injured innocence, expecting to make her very sorry that she had punished the wrong one. I expected her to do something remorseful and pathetic. I told her that I was not the one, it was Henry, but there was no upheaval. She said, without emotion, "It's all right, it isn't any matter. You deserve it for something you've done that I didn't know about, and if you haven't done it, then you deserve it for something that you are going to do, and I shan't hear about." There was a stairway outside the house, which led up to the rear part of the second story. One day Henry was sent on an errand, and he took a tin bucket along. I knew he would have to ascend those stairs, so I went up and locked the door on the inside, and came down into the garden, which had been newly plowed and was rich in choice firm clods of black mold. I gathered a generous equipment of these and ambushed him. I waited until he had climbed the stairs and was near the landing and couldn't escape. Then I bombarded him with clods, which he warded off with his tin bucket as best he could, but without much success, for I was a good marksman. The clods smashing against the weatherboarding fence fetched my mother out to see what was the matter, and I tried to explain that I was amusing Henry. Both of them were after me in a minute, but I knew the way over that high board fence and escaped for that time. After an hour or two, when I ventured back, there was no one around, and I thought the incident was closed, but it was not. Henry was ambushing me. With an unusually competent aim for him, he landed a stone on the side of my head, which raised a bump there that felt like the Matterhorn. I carried it to my mother straight away for sympathy, but she was not strongly moved. It seemed to B. Her idea that incidents like this would eventually inform me if I harvested enough of them. So the matter was only educational. I had had a sterner view of it than that before. It was not right to give the cat a painkiller. I realize it now. I would not repeat it in these days, but in those Tom Sawyer days, it was a great and sincere satisfaction to see Peter perform under its influence. And if actions do speak as loud as words, he took as much interest in it as I did. It was a most detestable medicine, Perry Davis's painkiller. Mr. Pavey's Negro man, who was a person of good judgment and considerable curiosity, wanted to sample it, and I let him. It was his opinion that it was made of hellfire. Those were the cholera days of '49. The people living along the Mississippi were paralyzed with fright. Those who could run away did it, and those many died of fright in the flight. Fright killed 3 persons where the cholera killed 1. Those who couldn't flee kept themselves drenched with cholera preventatives, and my mother chose Perry Davis's painkiller for me. She was not distressed about herself. She avoided that kind of preventative, but she made me promise to take a teaspoonful of painkiller every day. Originally, it was my intention to keep the promise, but at that time I did not know as much about painkiller as I knew after my first experiment with it. She didn't watch Henry's bottle. She could trust Henry, but she marked my bottle with a pencil on the label every day and examined it to see if the teaspoonful had been removed. The floor was not carpeted. It had cracks in it, and I fed the painkiller to the cracks with very good results. No cholera occurred down below. It was upon one of these occasions that the friendly cat came waving his tail and supplicating for painkiller, which he got, and then went into those hysterics which ended with his colliding with all the furniture in the room, and finally going out of the open window and carrying the flower pots with him, just in time for my mother to arrive and look over her glasses in petrified astonishment and say, "What in the world is the matter with Peter?" I don't remember what my explanation was, but if it is recorded in that book, it may not be the right one. Whenever my conduct was of such exaggerated impropriety that my mother's extemporary punishments were inadequate, she saved the matter up for Sunday and made me go to church Sunday night, which was a penalty sometimes bearable, perhaps, but as a rule it was not, and I avoided it for the sake of my constitution. She would never believe that I had been to church until she applied her first test. She made me tell her what the text was. That was a simple matter and caused me no trouble. I didn't have to go to church to get a text. I selected one for myself. This worked very well until one time when my text and the one furnished by a neighbor who had been to church didn't tally. After that, my mother took other methods. I don't know what they were now. In those days, men and boys wore rather long cloaks in the winter-time. They were black and were lined with very bright and showy Scotch plaids. One winter night, when I was starting to church to square a crime of some time committed during the week, I hid my cloak near the gate and went off and played with the other boys until church was over. Then I returned home, but in the dark I put on the cloak wrong side out, into the room, threw the cloak aside, and then stood the usual examination. I got along very well until the temperature of the church was mentioned. My mother said, "It must have been impossible to keep warm there on such a night." I didn't see the art of that remark, and was foolish enough to explain that I wore my cloak all the time that I was in that church. She asked if I kept it on from church home, too. I didn't see the bearing of that remark. I said that was what I had done. She said, You wore it in church with that red Scotch plaid outside and glaring. Didn't that attract any attention? Of course, to continue such a dialogue would have been tedious and unprofitable. I let it go and took the consequences. That was about 1849. Tom Nash was a boy of my own age, the postmaster's son. The Mississippi was frozen across, and he and I went skating one night, probably without permission. I cannot see why we should go skating in the night unless without permission, for there could be no considerable amusement to be gotten out of skating at night if no one was going to object to it. About midnight, when we were more than half a mile out towards the Illinois shore, we heard some ominous rumbling and grinding and crashing going on between us and the home side of the river, and we knew what it meant. The ice was breaking up. We started for home, pretty badly scared. We flew along at full speed whenever the moonlight sifting down between the clouds enabled us to tell which was ice and which was water. In the pauses we waited, started again whenever there was a good bridge of ice, paused again when we came to naked water, and waited in distress until a floating vast cake should bridge that place. It took us an hour to make the trip, a trip which we made in a misery of apprehension all the time, but at last we arrived within a very brief distance of the shore. We waited again. There was another place that needed bridging. All about us the ice was plunging and grinding along and piling itself up in mountains on the shore, and the dangers were increasing, not diminishing. We grew very impatient to get solid ground, so we started too early and went springing from cake to cake. Tom made a miscalculation and fell short. He got a bitter bath, but he was so close to shore that he only had to swim a stroke or two. Then his feet struck hard bottom and he crawled out. I arrived a little later without accident. We had been in a drenching perspiration, and Tom's bath was a disaster for him. He took to his bed sick and had a procession of diseases. The closing one was scarlet fever, and he came out of it stone deaf. Within a year or two, speech departed, of course, but some years later he was taught to talk after a fashion. One couldn't always make out what it was he was trying to say. Of course, he could not modulate his voice, since he couldn't hear himself talk. When he supposed he was talking low and confidentially, you could hear him in Illinois. 4 years ago, 1902, I was invited to the University of Missouri to come out there and receive the honorary degree of LL.D. I took that opportunity to spend a week in Hannibal, a city now, a village in my day. It had been 53 years since Tom Nash and I had had that adventure. When I was at the railway station ready to leave Hannibal, there was a crowd of citizens there. I saw Tom Nash approaching me across a vacant space, and I walked towards him, for I recognized him at once. He was old and white-headed, but the boy of 15 was still visible in him. He came up to me, made a trumpet of his hands at my ear, nodded his head toward the citizens, and said confidentially, in a yell like a foghorn, "Same damned fools, Sam." From Susie's biography. Papa was about 20 years old when he went on the Mississippi as a pilot. Just before he started on his trip, Grandma Clemens asked him to promise her on the Bible not to touch intoxicating liquors or swear, and he said, "Yes, Mother, I will." And he kept that promise 7 years when Grandma released him from it. Under the inspiring influence of that remark, what a garden of forgotten reforms rises upon my sight. From Susie's biography. Papa made arrangements to read at Vassar College the 1st of May, and I went with him. We went by way of New York City. Mama went with us to show us to New York, and stayed 2 days to do some shopping. We started Tuesday at 2:30 in the afternoon and reached New York about 6:15. Papa went right up to General Grant's from the station, and Mama and I went to the Everett house. Aunt Clara came to supper with us up in our room. We and Aunt Clara were going to the theater right after supper, and we expected Papa to take us there and to come home as early as he could. But we got through dinner and he didn't come, and Mama got more perplexed and worried. But at last we thought we would have to go without him. So we put on our things and started downstairs, but before we'd gotten half down, we met Papa coming up with a great bunch of roses in his hand. He explained that the reason he was so late was that his watch stopped and he didn't notice and kept thinking an hour earlier than it really was. The roses that he carried were some Colonel Fred Grant sent to Mama. We went to the theater and enjoyed Adonis, word illegible, acted very much. We reached home about 11:30 and went right to bed. Wednesday morning we got up rather late and had breakfast about 9:30. After breakfast, Mama went out shopping, and Papa and I went to see Papa's agent about some business matters. After Papa had gotten through talking to Cousin Charlie Webster, Papa's agent, we went to get a friend of Papa's, Major Pond, to go and see a dog show with us. Then we went to see the dogs with Major Pond, and we had a delightful time seeing so many dogs together. When we got through seeing the dogs, Papa thought he would go and see General Grant, and I went with him. This was April 29, 1855. Papa went up into General Grant's room, and he took me with him. I felt greatly honored and delighted when Papa took me into General Grant's room and let me see the General and Colonel Grant, for General Grant is a man I shall be glad all my life that I have seen. Papa and General Grant had a long talk together, and Papa has written an account of his talk and visit with General Grant for me to put into this biography. Susie has inserted in this place that account of mine as follows. April 29, 1855. I called on General Grant and took Susie with me. The General was looking and feeling far better than he had looked or felt for some months, and he had ventured to work again on his book that morning, the first time he had done any work for perhaps a month. This morning's work was his first attempt at dictating, and it was a thorough success to his great delight. He had always said that it would be impossible for him to dictate anything, but I had said that he was noted for clearness of statement, and as a narrative was simply a statement of consecutive facts, he was consequently peculiarly qualified and equipped for dictation. This turned out to be true, for he had dictated 2 hours that morning to a shorthand writer, and had never hesitated for words, had not repeated himself, and the manuscript, when finished, needed no revision. The 2 hours' work was an account of Appomattox, and this was such an extremely important feature that his book would necessarily have been severely lame without it. Therefore, I had taken a shorthand writer there before to see if I could not get him to write at least a few lines about Appomattox, but he was at that time not well enough to undertake it. I was aware that of all the 100 versions of Appomattox, not one was really correct. Therefore, I was extremely anxious that he should leave behind him the truth. His throat was not distressing him, and his voice was much better and stronger than usual. He was so delighted to have gotten Appomattox accomplished once more in his life, to have gotten the matter off his mind, that he was as talkative as his old self. He received Susie very pleasantly, and then fell to talking about certain matters which he hoped to be able to dictate the next day, and he said in substance that, among other things, he wanted to settle once and for all a question that had been bandied about from month to month and from newspaper to newspaper. That question was with whom originated the idea of the march to the sea. Was it Grant's or was it Sherman's idea? Whether I or someone else, being anxious to get the important fact settled, asked him with whom the idea originated, I don't remember. But I remember his answer. I will always remember his answer. General Grant said, "Neither of us originated the idea of Sherman's march to the sea. The enemy did it." He went on to say that the enemy, however, necessarily originated a great many of the plans that the general on the opposite side gets credit for. At the same time that the enemy is doing that, he is laying open other moves which the opposing general sees and takes advantage of. In this case, Sherman had a plan all thought out, of course. He meant to destroy the 2 remaining railroads in that part of the country, and that would finish up that region. But General Hood did not play the military part that he was expected to play. On the contrary, General Hood made a dive at Chattanooga. This left the march to the sea open to Sherman, and so after sending part of his army to defend and hold what he had acquired in the Chattanooga region, he was perfectly free to proceed with the rest of it through Georgia. He saw the opportunity, and he would not have been fit for his place if he had not seized it. He wrote me, the general is speaking, what his plan was, and I sent him word to go ahead. My staff were opposed to the movement. I think the general said they tried to persuade him to stop Sherman. The chief of his staff, the general said, even went so far as to go to Washington without the general's knowledge and get the ear of the authorities, and he succeeded in arousing their fears to such an extent that they telegraphed General Grant to stop Sherman. Then General Grant said, out of deference to the government, I telegraphed Sherman and stopped him for 24 hours, and then, considering that that was deference enough to the government, I telegraphed him to go ahead again. I have not tried to give the general's language, but only the general idea of what he said. The thing that mainly struck me was his terse remark that the enemy originated the idea of the march to the sea. It struck me because it was so suggestive of the general's epigrammatic fashion, saying a great deal in a single crisp sentence. This is my account, and signed Mark Twain. Susie resumes. After Papa and General Grant had had their talk, we went back to the hotel where Mama was, and Papa told Mama all about his interview with General Grant. Mama and I had a nice quiet afternoon together. That pair of devoted comrades were always shutting themselves up together when there was an opportunity to have what Susie called a cozy time. From Susie's nursery days to the end of her life, she and her mother were close friends, intimate friends, passionate adorers of each other. Susie's was a beautiful mind, and it made her an interesting comrade. And with the fine mind, she had a heart like her mother's. Susie never had an interest or an occupation which she was not glad to put aside for something which was in all cases more precious to her, a visit with her mother. Susie died at the right time, the fortunate time of her life, the happy age, 24 years. At 24, such a girl has seen the best of life. Life is a happy dream. After that age, the risks begin. Responsibility comes, and with it, the cares, the sorrows, and the inevitable tragedy. For her mother's sake, I would have brought her back for the grave if I could, but I would not have done it for my own. From Susie's biography. Then Papa went to read in public. There were a great many authors that read that Thursday afternoon beside Papa. I would have liked to have gone and heard Papa read, But Papa said he was going to read in Vassar, just what he was planning to read in New York. So I stayed home with Mama. The next day, Mama planned to take the 4 o'clock car back to Hartford. We rose quite early in the morning and went to the Vienna bakery and took breakfast there. From there, we went to a German bookstore and bought some German books for Clara's birthday. Dear me, the power of association to snatch moldy dead memories out of their graves and make them walk. That remark about buying foreign books throws a sudden white glare upon the distant past, and I see the long stretch of a New York street with an unearthly vividness, and John Hay walking down it, grave and remorseful. I was walking down it too that morning, and I overtook Hay and asked him what the trouble was. He turned a lusterless eye on to me and said, "My case is beyond cure. In the most innocent way in the world, I have committed a crime which will never be forgiven by the sufferers, for they will never believe. Oh, well, no, I was going to say they would never believe that I did the thing innocently. The truth is, they will know that I acted innocently, because they are rational people. But what of that? I never can look them in the face again, nor they me, perhaps." Hay was a young bachelor, and at the time was on the Tribune staff. He explained his trouble in these words substantially. "When I was passing along here yesterday morning, on my way down to the office, I stepped into a bookstore where I am acquainted, and asked if they had anything new from the other side. They handed me a French novel in the usual yellow paper cover, and I carried it away. I didn't even look at the title of it, for it was for recreation reading, and I was on my way to work. I went mooning and dreaming along. I think I hadn't got more than 50 yards when I heard my name called. I stopped, and a private carriage drew up at the sidewalk, and I shook hands with the inmates, mother and young daughter. Excellent people. They were on their way to the steamer to sail for Paris. The mother said, 'I saw that book in your hand, and I judged by the look of it that it was a French novel. Is it?' I said it was. She said, 'Do let me have it, so that my daughter can practice her French on it on the way over.' Of course I handed her the book, and we parted. 10 minutes ago, I was passing that bookstore again, and I stepped in and fetched away another copy of that book. Here it is. Read the first page. That is enough. You will know what the rest is like. I think it must be the foulest book in the French language, one of the foulest, anyway. I would be ashamed to offer it to a harlot, but oh dear, I gave it to that sweet young girl without shame. Take my advice. Don't give away a book until you've examined it." From Susie's biography. Then Mama and I went to do some shopping, and Papa went to see General Grant. After we had finished doing our shopping, we went home to the hotel together. When we entered our rooms in the hotel, we saw on the table a vase full of exquisite red roses. Mama, who is very fond of flowers, exclaimed, "Oh, I wonder who could have sent them." We both looked at the card in the midst of the roses and saw that it was written on in Papa's handwriting. It was written in German. "Lies Geschenk on die Mama." I am sure I didn't say "on." That is Susie's spelling, not mine. Also, I am sure I didn't spell Geschenk so liberally as all that. SLC. Mama was delighted. Papa came home and gave Mama her ticket. After visiting a while with her, went to see Major Pond, and Mama and I sat down to our lunch. After lunch, most of our time was taken up with packing, and at about 3 o'clock we went to escort Mama to the train. We got on board the train with her and stayed with her about 5 minutes, and then we said goodbye. And the train started for Hartford. It was the first time I had ever been away from home without Mama in my life, although I was 13 years old. Papa and I drove back to the hotel and got Major Pond, and then went to see the Brooklyn Bridge. We went across it to Brooklyn on the cars, and then walked back across it from Brooklyn to New York. We enjoyed looking at the beautiful scenery, and we could see the bridge move under the intense heat of the sun. We had a perfectly delightful time, but we were pretty tired when we got back to the hotel. The next morning, we rose early, took our breakfast, and took an early train to Poughkeepsie. We had a very pleasant journey to Poughkeepsie. The Hudson was magnificent, shrouded with beautiful mist. When we arrived to Poughkeepsie, it was raining quite hard, which fact greatly disappointed me because I very much wanted to see the outside of the buildings of Vassar College, and as it rained, that would be impossible. It was quite a long drive from the station to Vassar College, and Papa and I had a nice long time to discuss and laughed over German profanity. One of the German phrases Papa particularly enjoys is "O Heilige Maria Mutter Jesus." Jean has a German nurse, and this was one of her phrases. There was a time when Jean explained "Ach Gott" to every trifle, but when Mama found it out, she was shocked and instantly put a stop to it. It brings that pretty little German girl vividly before me, a sweet and innocent and plump little creature with peachy cheeks, a clear-souled little maiden without offense, notwithstanding her profanities. And she was loaded to the eyebrows with them. She was a mere child. She was not 15 yet. She was just from Germany and knew no English. She was always scattering her profanities around, and they were such a satisfaction to me that I never dreamed of such a thing as modifying her. For my own sake, I had no disposition to tell on her. Indeed, I took pains to keep her from being found out. I told her to confine her religious exercises to the children's quarters, and urged her to remember that Mrs. Clemens was prejudiced against pieties on weekdays. To the children, the little maid's profanities sounded natural and proper and right, because they had been used to that kind of talk in Germany, and they attached no evil importance to it. It grieves me that I have forgotten those vigorous remarks. I long hoarded them in my memory as a treasure, but I remember one of them still because I heard it so many times. The trial of that little creature's life was the children's hair. She would tug and strain with her comb, accompanying her work with misplaced pieties, and when she finally was through with her little triple job, she always fired up and exploded her thanks towards the sky, where they belonged in this form. Gott sei Dank, ich bin fertig mit dem Gott-Verdunkshaar. I believe I am not always quite brave enough to translate it. From Susie's biography. We at length reached Vassar College, and she looked very finely, her buildings and her grounds being very beautiful. We went to the front door and rang the bell. The young girl who came to the door wished to know who we wanted to see. Evidently, we were not expected. Papa told her we wanted to see who we wanted to see, and she showed us to the parlor. We waited. No one came, and waited. No one came. Still no one came. It was beginning to seem pretty awkward. "Oh, well, this is a pretty piece of business," Papa exclaimed. At length, we heard footsteps coming down the long corridor, and Miss C., the lady who had invited Papa, came into the room. She greeted Papa very pleasantly, and they had a nice little chat together. Soon the lady principal also entered, and she was very pleasant and agreeable. She showed us to our rooms and said she would send to us when dinner was ready. We went into our rooms, but we had nothing to do for half an hour except to watch the raindrops as they fell upon the window panes. At last we were called to dinner, and I went down with Papa, as he never eats anything in the middle of the day, and I sat at the table with the lady principal and enjoyed very much seeing all the young girls trooping into the dining room. After dinner, I went around the college with the young ladies, and Papa stayed in his room and smoked. When it was supper time, Papa went down and ate supper with us, and we had a very delightful supper. After supper, the young ladies went to their rooms to dress for the evening. Papa went to his room, and I went with the lady principal. At length the guests began to arrive, but Papa still remained in his room until called for. Papa read in the chapel. It was the first time I had ever seen him read in my life. That is in public. When he came out onto the stage, I remember the people behind me exclaimed, "Oh, how queer he is! Isn't he funny?" I thought Papa was very funny, although I did not think him queer. He read A Trying Situation and The Golden Arm, a ghost story that he had heard down south when he was a little boy. The Golden Arm Papa had told me before, but he had startled me so much that I did not wish to hear it again. But I had resolved this time to be prepared and to not let myself be startled. But still Papa did, and very, very much. He startled the whole room full of people, and they jumped as one man. The other story was also very funny and interesting, and I enjoyed the evening inexpressibly much. After Papa had finished reading, we all went down to the collation in the dining room, and after that there was dancing and singing. Then the guests went away, and Papa and I went to bed. The next morning we rose early, took an early train to Hartford, and reached Hartford at 2:30. We were very glad to get back. How charitably she treats that ghastly experience. It is a dear and lovely disposition, and a most valuable one, that can brush away indignities and discourtesies and seek and find the pleasanter features of an experience. Susie had that disposition, and it was one of the jewels of her character that had come to her straight from her mother. It is a feature that was left out of me at birth, and at 70 I have not yet acquired it. I did not go to Vassar College professionally, but as a guest and a gratis. Aunt Clara, now Mrs. John B. Staunchfield, was a graduate of Vassar, and it was to please her that I inflicted that journey upon Susie and myself. The invitation had come to me from both the lady mentioned by Susie and the president of the college, a sour old saint who has probably been gathered to his fathers long ago, and I hope they enjoy him. I hope they value his society. I think I can get along without it in either end of the next world. We arrived at the college in that soaking rain, and Susie has described, with just a suggestion of dissatisfaction, the sort of reception we got. Susie had to sit in her damp clothes half an hour while we waited in the parlor. Then she was taken to a fireless room and left to wait there again, as she has stated. I do not remember that president's name, and I am sorry. He did not put in an appearance until it was time for me to step upon the platform in front of that great garden of young and lovely blossoms. He caught up with me and advanced upon the platform with me and was going to introduce me. I said, in substance, "You have allowed me to get along without your help thus far, and if you will retire from the platform, I will try to do the rest without it." I did not see him any more, but I detest his memory. Of course, my resentment did not extend to the students, and so I had an unforgettable good time talking to them, and I think they had a good time too, for they responded as one man, to use Susie's unimpoverishable phrase. Girls are charming creatures. I shall have to be twice 70 years old before I change my mind as to that. I am to talk to a crowd of them this afternoon, students of Barnard College, the sex's annex to Columbia University, and I think I shall have as pleasant a time with those lasses as I had with the Vassar girls 21 years ago. From Susie's biography. I stopped in the middle of Mama's early history to tell about our trip to Vassar because I was afraid I would forget about it. Now I will go on where I left off. Some time after Miss Emma Nye died, Papa took Mama and little Langdon to Elmira for the summer. When in Elmira, Langdon began to fail, but I think Mama did not know just what was the matter with him. I was the cause of the child's illness. His mother trusted him to my care, and I took him a long drive in an open barouche for an airing. It was a raw, cold morning, but he was well wrapped about with furs, and, in the hands of a careful person, no harm would have come to him. But I soon dropped into a reverie and forgot all about my charge. The furs fell away and exposed his bare legs. By and by the coachman noticed this, and I arranged the wraps again, but it was too late. The child was almost frozen. I hurried home with him. I was aghast at what I had done, and I feared the consequences. I have always felt shame for that treacherous morning's work, and have not allowed myself to think of it when I could help it. I doubt if I had the courage to make confession at that time. I think it most likely that I have never confessed until now. From Susie's biography. At last it was time for Papa to return to Hartford, and Langdon was real sick at that time, but still Mama decided to go with him, thinking the journey might do him good. But after they reached Hartford, he became very sick, and his trouble proved to be diphtheria. He died about a week after Mama and Papa reached Hartford. He was buried by the side of Grandpa at Elmira, New York. Susie rests there with him. After that, Mama became very, very ill, so ill that there seemed great danger of death, but with a great deal of good care, she recovered. Some months afterward, Mama and Papa, and Susie, who was perhaps 14 or 15 months old at the time, went to Europe and stayed for a time in Scotland and England. In Scotland, Mama and Papa became quite well acquainted with Dr. John Brown, the author of Rab and His Friends. And he met, but was not so well acquainted with Mr. Charles Kingsley, Mr. Henley M. Stanley, Sir Thomas Hardy, grandson of the Captain Hardy, to whom Nelson said, "Kiss me, Hardy," when dying on shipboard. Mr. Henry Irving, Robert Browning, Sir Charles Dilke, Mr. Charles Reade, Mr. William Black, Lord Houghton, Frank Buckland, Mr. Tom Hughes, Anthony Trollope, Tom Hood, son of the poet, and Mama and Papa were quite well acquainted with Dr. MacDonald and family, and Papa met Harrison Ainsworth. I remember all these men very well indeed, except the last one. I do not recall Ainsworth. By my count, Susie mentions 14 men. They are all dead except Sir Charles Dilke. We met a great many other interesting people, among them Lewis Carroll, author of the immortal Alice, but he was only interesting to look at, for he was the stillest and shyest full-grown man I have ever met, except Uncle Remus. Dr. MacDonald and several other lively talkers were present, and the talk went on, briskly on, for a couple of hours, but Carroll sat still all the while, except that now and then he answered a question. His answers were brief. I do not remember that he elaborated any of them. At dinner at Smalley's, we met Herbert Spencer. At a large luncheon party at Lord Houghton's, we met Sir Arthur Helps, who was a celebrity of worldwide fame at the time, but is quite forgotten now. Lord Elcho, a large, vigorous man, sat at some distance down the table. He was talking earnestly about Godalming. It was a deep and flowing and an unarticulated rumble, but I got the Godalming pretty clearly every time it broke free of the rumble, and as all the strength was on the first and end of the word, it startled me every time, because it sounded so like swearing. In the middle of the luncheon, Lady Houghton rose, remarked to the guests on her right and on her left in a matter-of-fact way, "Excuse me, I have an engagement," and without further ceremony she went off to meet it. This would have been doubtful etiquette in America. Lord Houghton told a number of delightful stories. He told them in French, and I lost nothing of them but the nubs. I was always heedless. I was born heedless, and therefore I was constantly and quite unconsciously committing breaches of the minor proprieties, which brought upon me humiliations which ought to have humiliated me, but didn't, because I didn't know anything had happened. But Livy knew, and so the humiliations fell to her share, poor child, who had not earned them and did not deserve them. She always said I was the most difficult child she had. She was very sensitive about me. It distressed her to see me do heedless things which could bring me under criticism, and so she was always watchful and alert to protect me from the kind of transgressions which I have been speaking of. When I was leaving Hartford for Washington upon the occasion referred to, she said, I have written a small warning and put it in a pocket of your dress vest. When you are dressing to go to the author's reception at the White House, you will naturally put your fingers in your vest pockets according to your custom, and you will find that little note there. Read it carefully and do as it tells you. I cannot be with you, and so I delegate my sentry duties to this little note. If I should give you the warning by word of mouth now, it would pass from your head and be forgotten in a few moments. It was President Cleveland's first term. I had never seen his wife, the young, the beautiful, the good-hearted, the sympathetic, the fascinating. Sure enough, just as I had finished dressing to go to the White House, I found that little note, which I had long ago forgotten. It was a grave little note, a serious little note, like its writer, but it made me laugh. Livy's gentle gravities often produced that effect upon me, where the expert humorist's best joke would have failed, for I do not laugh easily. When we reached the White House and I was shaking hands with the president, he started to say something, but I interrupted him and said, If your excellency will excuse me, I will come back in a moment, but now I have a very important matter to attend to, and it must be attended to at once. I turned to Mrs. Cleveland, the young, the beautiful, and the fascinating, and gave her my card, on the back of which I had written. He didn't, and I asked her to sign her name below those words. She said, He didn't? He didn't what? Oh, I said, never mind. We cannot stop to discuss that now. This is urgent. Won't you please sign your name? I handed her a fountain pen. Why, she said, I cannot commit myself in that way. Who is it that didn't? And what is it that he didn't? Oh, I said, time is flying, flying, flying. Won't you take me out of my distress and sign your name to it? It's all right. I give you my word, it's all right. She looked nonplussed, but hesitatingly and mechanically she took the pen and said, I will sign it. I will take the risk. But you must tell me about it right afterward, so that you can be arrested before you get out of the house, in case there should be anything criminal about this. Then she signed, and I handed her Mrs. Clemens's note, which was very brief, very simple, and to the point. It said, Don't wear your arctics in the White House. It made her shout, and at my request she summoned a messenger, and we sent that card at once to the mail on its way to Mrs. Clemens in Hartford. When the little Ruth was about a year or a year and a half old, Mason, an old and valued friend of mine, was consul general at Frankfurt on the Main. I had known him well in 1867, 68, and 69 in America, and I and mine had spent a good deal of time with him and his family in Frankfurt in 78. He was a thoroughly competent, diligent, and conscientious official. Indeed, he possessed these qualities in so large a degree that among American consuls he might fairly said to be monumental, for at that time our consular service was largely, and I think may say mainly, in the hands of ignorant, vulgar, and incapable men who had been political healers in America, and had been taken care of by transference to consulates where where they could be supported at the government's expense instead of being transferred to the poorhouse, which would have been cheaper and more patriotic. Mason, in 78, had been consul general in Frankfurt several years, 4, I think. He had come from Marseille with a great record. He had been consul there during 13 years, and one part of his record was heroic. There had been a desolating cholera epidemic, and Mason was the only representative of any foreign country who stayed at his post and saw it through. And during that time, he not only represented his own country, but he represented all the other countries in Christendom and did their work, and did it well, and was praised for it by them in words of no uncertain sound. This great record of Mason's had saved him from official decapitation straight along while Republican presidents occupied the chair, but now it was occupied by a Democrat. Mr. Cleveland was not seated in it. He was not yet inaugurated. Before he was deluged with applications from Democratic politicians desiring the appointment of 1,000 or so politically useful Democrats to Mason's place. A year or two later, Mason wrote me and asked if I couldn't do something to save him from destruction. I was very anxious to keep him in his place, but at first I could not think of any way to help him. For I was a mugwump. We, the mugwumps, a little company made up of the unenslaved of both parties, the very best men to be found in the two great parties, that was our idea of it, voted 60,000 strong for Mr. Cleveland in New York and elected him. Our principles were high and very definite. We were not a party. We had no candidates. We had no axes to grind. Our vote laid upon the man we cast it for no obligation of any kind. By our rule, we could not ask for office. We could not accept office. When voting, it was our duty to vote for the best man, regardless of his party name. We had no other creed. Vote for the best man. That was creed enough. Such being my situation, I was puzzled to know how to try to help Mason and, at the same time, save my mugwump purity undefiled. It was a delicate place, but presently, out of the ruck of confusions in my mind, rose a sane thought, clear and bright, to wit, since it was a mugwump's duty to do his best to put the best man in office, necessarily it must be a mugwump's duty to keep the best man in when he was already there. My course was easy now. It might not be quite delicate for a mugwump to approach the president directly, but I could approach him indirectly with all delicacy, since in that case not even courtesy would require him to take notice of an application which no one could prove had ever reached him. Yes, it was easy and simple sailing now. I could lay the matter before Ruth in her cradle and wait for results. I wrote the little child and said to her all that I have just been saying about the mugwump principles and the limitations which they put upon me. I explained that it would not be proper for me to apply to her father in Mr. Mason's behalf, but I detailed her to Mr. Mason's high and honorable record, and suggested that she take the matter in her own hands and do a patriotic work which I felt some delicacy about venturing upon myself. I asked her to forget that her father was only President of the United States and her subject and servant. I asked her not to put her application in the form of a command, but to modify it and give it the fictitious and pleasanter form of a mere request. That it would be no harm to let him gratify himself with the superstition that he was independent and could do as he pleased in the matter. I begged her to put stress, and plenty of it, upon the proposition that to keep Mason in his place would be a benefaction to the nation, to enlarge upon that and keep still about all other considerations. In due time, I received a letter from the President, written in his own hand, signed by his own hand, acknowledging Ruth's intervention and thanking me for enabling him to save the country the services of so so good and well trained a servant as Mason, and thanking me also for the detailed fullness of Mason's record, which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Mason was in his right place and ought to be kept there. Mason has remained in the service ever since and is now Consul General at Paris. During the time that we were living in Buffalo in 70 and 71, Mr. Cleveland was sheriff, but I never happened to make his acquaintance or even see him. In fact, I suppose I was not even aware of his existence. 14 years later, he was become the greatest man in the state. I was not living in the state at the time. He was governor and was about to step into the post of President of the United States. At that time, I was on the public highway in company with another bandit, George W. Cable. We were robbing the public with readings from our works during 4 months. And in the course of time we went to Albany to levy tribute, and I said, we ought to go and pay our respects to the governor. So Cable and I went to that majestic Capitol building and stated our errand. We were shown into the governor's private office, and I saw Mr. Cleveland for the first time. We three stood chatting together. I was born lazy, and I comforted myself by turning the corner of a table into a sort of seat. Presently the governor said, Mr. Clemens, I was a fellow citizen of yours in Buffalo a good while ago, and during those months you burst suddenly into a mighty fame out of a previous, long-continued, and no doubt proper obscurity. But I was a nobody, and you wouldn't notice me nor have anything to do with me. But now that I have become somebody, you have changed your style, and you come here to shake hands with me and be sociable. How do you explain this kind of conduct? Oh, I said, it is very simple, Your Excellency. In Buffalo, you were nothing but a sheriff. I was in society. I couldn't afford to associate with sheriffs. But you are a governor now, and you are on your way to the presidency. It is a great difference, and it makes you worthwhile. There appeared to be about 16 doors to that spacious room. From each door a young man now emerged, and the 16 lined up and moved forward and stood in front of the governor with an aspect of respectful expectancy in their attitude. No one spoke for a moment. Then the governor said, You are dismissed, gentlemen. Your services are not required. Mr. Clemens is sitting on the bells. There was a cluster of 16 bell buttons on the corner of the table. My proportions at that end of me were just right to enable me to cover the whole of that nest, and that is how I came to hatch out those 16 clerks, in accordance with the suggestion made in Gilder's letter recently received. I have written the following note to ex-President Cleveland upon his 69th birthday. Honored Sir, your patriotic virtues have won for you the homage of half of the nation and the enmity of the other. This places your character as a citizen upon a summit as high as Washington's. The verdict is unanimous and unassailable. The votes of both sides are necessary in cases like these, and the votes of the one side are quite as valuable as are the votes of the other. Where the votes are all in a man's favor, the verdict is against him. It is sand, and history will wash it away. But the verdict for you is rock, and will stand. In a diary which Mrs. Clemens kept for a little while, a great many years ago, I find various mentions of Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a near neighbor of ours in Hartford, with no fences between, and in those days she made as much use of our grounds as her own in pleasant weather. Her mind had decayed, and she was a pathetic figure. She wandered about all the day long in the care of a muscular Irish woman. Among the colonists of our neighborhood, the doors always stood open in pleasant weather. Mrs. Stowe entered them at her own free will, and as she was always softly slippered and generally full of animal spirits, she was able to deal in surprises, and she liked to do it. She would slip up behind a person who was deep in dreams and musing and fetch a war whoop that would jump a person out of his clothes. And she had other moods. Sometimes we would hear gentle music in the drawing room, and would find her there at the piano singing ancient and melancholy songs with infinitely touching effect. Her husband, old Professor Stowe, was a picturesque figure. He wore a broad slouch hat. He was a large man and solemn. His beard was white and thick and hung far down on his breast. The first time our little Susie ever saw him, she encountered him on the street near our home and came flying wide-eyed to her mother, and said, "Santa Claus has got loose!" Which reminds me of Reverend Charlie Stowe's little boy, a little boy of 7 years. I met Reverend Charlie crossing his mother's grounds one morning, and he told me this little tale. He had been out to Chicago to attend a convention of congressional clergymen, and had taken his little boy with him. During the trip, he reminded the little chap, every now and then, that he must be on his very best behavior there in Chicago. He said, "We shall be the guests of a clergyman, and there will be other guests, clergymen and their wives, and you must be careful to let those people see by your walk and conversation that you are of a godly household. Be very careful about this." The admonition bore fruit, and at the first breakfast, which they ate in the Chicago clergyman's house, he heard his little son say in the meekest and most reverent way to the lady opposite him, "Please, won't you for Christ's sake pass the butter?" "Please, won't you for Christ's sake pass the butter?"